Finna move on to a story that I'm still up in the air about how I'm gonna respond.
The room doesn't erupt right away. It tightens. There's a pause before he speaks again. Not the kind filled with confidence, but the kind where someone is deciding how much damage they're willing to accept once the words leave their mouth.
Are you aware of what really happened to you?
No, I'm not.
Or can you talk about
I can talk about it, but I'm not aware of what really happens.
His shoulders settle. His tone drops. And then he says it. He admits he's unsure how to respond to Tamar. That hesitation becomes the warning sign most viewers miss. Because what follows isn't gossip. It's correction. Moments earlier, Tamar is on camera.com, composed, offering uncertainty as protection. When asked if she knows what really happened to her, she answers softly, not with denial, not with accusation, but with distance. Tamar says she's not aware of what really happened to her. The internet doesn't hear innocence, it hears omission. And Funky hears something else entirely. His reaction isn't loud at first, it's controlled. He skips ahead, dismisses parts of the interview, and then turns directly toward the lens, not as a commentator, but as someone who was there. Someone whose name is already being dragged through comment sections he didn't ask to be part of. When he calls her a liar, it doesn't land like a punchline. It lands like a fracture. Funky bluntly calls Tamar a liar about that night within. Minutes, clips start spreading. Users rewind. Screenshots circulate. Threads multiply. Viewers begin stitching together pieces. A birthday party that wasn't really a party. A night that keeps changing shape depending on who's telling it. And injuries that were described publicly, but never explained. Then, Funky shifts the frame. He doesn't argue about feelings. He reconstructs the night. Restaurants, car rides, who arrived unannounced, who sat where, who went upstairs and who didn't. And when he
At all, because I'm telling you to your damn face, you was a bold-faced, bald-headed, goddamn liar, okay?
explains why he didn't follow Tamar into her own house, the temperature drops. Funky says Tamar and Mendeecees were kissing in the car, so he went home. That's the moment the internet stops debating tone and starts tracking movement. Because now the story isn't about confusion, it's about proximity. It's about silence. About why someone would claim they don't know what happened while refusing an ambulance. It's describing blood and letting speculation burn through everyone around them. Comment
his homeboy, okay? Now, this is the third time that me and you have been hanging out, and out of nowhere, here comes Mendeecees, okay? Now, you can make of that whatever the
comments flood in. Some defend Tamar. Others side with Funky. But almost everyone notices the same thing. One name keeps coming up. One person hasn't spoken. And one line refuses to fade. If anyone knows what happened upstairs, it wasn't
drive my car over the sauce. By the time I get the sauce, Zoe calls and says, Tamar said, just leave your car at her house and we gonna go to V12. I didn't even wanna go.
him. And once that implication settles in, this stops being a messy fallout and becomes something far more dangerous. Because when stories don't add up, the internet doesn't wait for answers. It invents pressure. What Funky does next is slow the story down until it can't hide anymore. He doesn't chase Tamar's emotions or speculate about her intentions. He dismantles the timeline she offered and replaces it with one grounded in logistics: who called whom, where they went, and how the night actually unfolded. The calm delivery is deliberate. It signals that what's coming isn't reaction, it's recollection. And that distinction matters, because the moment he reframes the night, Tamar's uncertainty begins to look less like confusion and more like insulation. He starts by rejecting the foundation of her interview outright: the birthday party narrative. The idea that the night revolved around her doing something generous for a friend. According to Funky, that framing isn't just inaccurate, it's strategic. He explains that Tamar and Zoe were simply looking for somewhere to eat, that they contacted him because everything near them was closed. and that he suggested Ruth's Chris as a last option. The night didn't begin as an event, began as a convenience. And that detail immediately undermines the emotional weight Tamar attached to it later. Then comes the first coincidence. One Funky doesn't label as coincidence at all. As soon as he arrives, Mendeecees walks in with a friend. He doesn't dramatize it. He doesn't accuse. He just notes that this wasn't the first time it happened. Okay? Funky notes Mendeecees showing up unannounced during multiple hangouts. That single observation changes the temperature.
I did not play it in this interview, but at the time in which you went to the internet, you said you woke up in a pool of blood and almost died. In this interview with L'Oreal, you mentioned that you were home with David or somebody, and they said, we need to call the ambulance, and you were like, no.
Because repetition removes plausibility. One surprise appearance can be chance. 3 starts to look like pattern, and Funky lets the audience do that math themselves. From there, the night splinters into movement. Plans change. Fatigue sets in. Funky says he wanted to go home, but the group decided to keep going. First to Sauce and Buckhead, then to V12. Even that shift matters because it introduces a choice point. Funky makes it clear he didn't want to continue. He drove separately. He resisted the reroute. And yet he was asked to abandon his car and ride with them instead. Funky describes being asked to leave his car and go elsewhere in isolation.
Because after her and Mendeecees got through kissing in the back of that goddamn car, I figured they wanted to be up there privately. That is why when we got dropped off at Tamar's house, I did not go upstairs. I got in my damn car and went home because you was sitting on his lap in that goddamn Uber and y'all ass was kissing, okay? And the shit made me damn uncomfortable.
Isolation. It's minor. In context, it's control. Someone
is Mendeecees and his best friend, because they was the ones who went upstairs with you. Now, I don't know whether
directing the flow of the night, someone ensuring proximity. And as Funky recounts it, the story Tamar told about casually returning home and losing awareness begins to feel curated rather than organic. The discomfort he describes isn't sudden, it's cumulative. He talks about seeing Tamar and Mendeecees together repeatedly at restaurants, at a music video shoot, in situations that blurred boundaries. He admits plainly that he was never comfortable with their dynamic. Not because of rumors, but because of what he witnessed in front of him. And again, he doesn't accuse. He catalogs. By the time they're in the car heading back to Tamar's house, the tension has already peaked. Funky doesn't raise his voice here. He doesn't embellish. He explains why he didn't go upstairs in a single devastating sentence. Funky explains he didn't go upstairs because Tamar and Mendeecees were kissing in the car at that moment reorients everything. Because up until then, the public conversation had centered on whether Funky abandoned a friend, whether he failed to protect her, whether his absence implied negligence. But his explanation flips the narrative entirely. He didn't leave because he didn't care. He left because he believed they wanted privacy, and that belief matters, because it directly contradicts Tamar's later portrayal of confusion and isolation. Funky's recounting removes ambiguity from one critical point. Tamar was not alone. Not emotionally, not socially, and, according to him, not physically. When he says she was sitting on Mendeecees' lap in the Uber, the image lands with force because it's specific. Viewers don't debate whether it's appropriate. They debate whether it could coexist with a claim of not knowing what happened later. That's when the conversation online begins to fracture. Commenters stop asking whether Tamar was wronged by Funky and start asking who else was present and why that presence hasn't been addressed. Funky doesn't say what happened upstairs. He's careful not to. But he does say who went. Funky says Mendeecees and his friend were the ones who went upstairs. That line becomes the axis around which the rest of the discourse spins, because it introduces proximity at the exact moment Tamar later describes injury, blood, and a refusal to call an ambulance. Funky revisits those claims, not to mock them, but to question their coherence. He recalls Tamar saying she woke up in a pool of blood and almost died. Then contrasts that with her admission that someone suggested calling emergency services and she declined. Funky questions Tamar refusing an ambulance after claiming she almost died. The implication isn't that nothing happened. It's that whatever happened wasn't treated like an emergency by the person experiencing it. And that inconsistency fuels speculation, not because Funky invents it, but because Tamar leaves it open. As this section of the monologue circulates, the internet begins layering meanings on top of it. Viewers point out the gaps, the lack of explanation for the injuries, the speed of recovery, Funky references later, the absence of names in Tamar's account, paired with the precision in Funky's. And in that vacuum, theories emerge, not as facts, but as attempts to resolve cognitive dissonance. This is where the title's language begins to take shape in public spaces. Not from the transcript itself, but from how people respond to it. Mentions of health tests, whispered reports, and worst-case assumptions appear in comment sections and reposts, always framed as claims, never confirmations. Funky never utters those words, but his detailed reconstruction gives them a surface to cling to. The pressure doesn't just build around Tamar, it shifts toward Yandy. Funky names her once, near the end of his account, and does so with restraint. Funky says the only person wronged was Yandy. That single sentence detonates another line of inquiry. Because if Yandy was wronged, then someone close to her crossed a boundary. And if that boundary was crossed on a night filled with secrecy, rerouted plans, and unexplained injuries, then silence begins to look less like dignity and more like containment. Section 1 ends where certainty dissolves. Funky doesn't claim crimes, he doesn't confirm tests. He doesn't describe what happened upstairs. What he does is far more destabilizing. He establishes who was present, who left, and who later claimed not to know. And once those coordinates are set, the story no longer belongs to any one person, it belongs to the gaps. Once Funky finishes laying out who was, where, and when, the conversation online stops being about emotion and becomes about exposure. Viewers no longer argue over tone or delivery, begin isolating inconsistencies, not new ones, the same. Unresolved elements Tamar herself introduced, now replayed under a harsher light. Her own words about not knowing what happened. Her public description of blood and injury. Her refusal by her own admission to involve emergency services. None of that is added by Funky. He simply refuses to let those details exist without consequence. This is where the atmosphere around Tamar's condition darkens. It's not because of any new revelation, but because nothing is clarified. The interview she gave offered vulnerability without explanation, crisis without cause. In an environment already charged by Funky's account, that vagueness becomes combustible. Commenters begin revisiting the language she used, how she framed the night as something that happened to her, not something she participated in. How she described coming home, washing her face, and then losing awareness. The absence of a transition between those moments becomes its own story. And that's where speculation takes hold. Not as accusation, but as response. When someone publicly describes severe injury, yet maintains uncertainty about its origin, audiences fill the silence. They don't do it maliciously at first. They do it because humans seek coherence. And when coherence isn't offered, they assemble it themselves. The phrase "test confirmed" doesn't appear in Funky's transcript. It emerges in comment sections, stitched videos, reaction clips. Always framed as something seen, something heard, something whispered elsewhere. Viewers repeatedly qualify it allegedly, according to blogs. People are saying, but repetition gives weight. And as those words circulate, they begin attaching themselves retroactively to the timeline Funky described. Not as proof, but as pressure. The more pressure builds, the more Tamar's silence amplifies it. She doesn't clarify the nature of her injuries. She doesn't explain the gap between claiming to almost die and refusing an ambulance. She doesn't address why she insists she doesn't know what happened while others were present. Each omission becomes interpretive space, and the internet is never gentle with empty space. What changes the direction of that speculation is Funky's insistence that the narrative was crafted. He doesn't say Tamar lied about being hurt. He says she curated confusion. That distinction matters. It suggests intention without naming outcome. And once intention is suspected, audiences start looking for motive. That's when Yandy's name stops being
wrong in this situation is Yandy, and I'ma leave it at that. Moving right along.
being peripheral. Funky's single statement about her being the only one wronged detonates quietly. It reframes the entire situation away from injury and toward betrayal. If Yandy was wronged, then someone close to her crossed a line. If that line was crossed on the same night, Tamar, later described as traumatic, then the two threads health and secrecy become inseparable. This is where the title's second clause gains traction. Yandy reveals everything doesn't refer to a press conference or a public statement. It reflects how viewers interpret silence under pressure. Fans begin theorizing that whatever Yandy knows, she knows privately. That if this situation has entered legal conversations, family conversations, or protective conversations, then revelation doesn't have to be public to be complete. Online. People begin reframing Yandy's absence not as avoidance, but as containment. They speculate that what's being withheld isn't for the audience's benefit, but for survival. That idea spreads because it aligns with the behavior pattern. The transcript describes people choosing what to say, what not to say, and when to withdraw, and once that framework takes hold, the word court enters the conversation, not because Funky mentions legal proceedings. He doesn't, but because his language mirrors something familiar: testimony. He recounts events in order. He establishes discomfort, explains decisions. He repeats certain phrases, not for emphasis, but for accuracy. Viewers notice that cadence. They compare it to statements made under pressure, not for entertainment, but for record. From there, speculation escalates into imagined consequence. Commenters begin asking whether legal counsel is involved, whether silence is strategic, whether certain phrases are being avoided intentionally. None of this is confirmed, but the transcript's tone invites it. Funky's refusal to dramatize, paired with his refusal to retract, creates the impression of someone who believes their account will withstand scrutiny. That belief infects the audience. Suddenly, Tamar's condition is no longer viewed in isolation. It's discussed alongside liability, alongside exposure, alongside who might benefit from ambiguity. The health narrative becomes less about sympathy and more about containment. Viewers ask why injuries are described publicly but origins remain unnamed, why clarity is offered selectively, why emotion is shared but detail is withheld. The speculation doesn't accuse, it interrogates, and in doing so, creates a courtroom in the comments section. Mendeecees becomes the focal point of that imagined room. Not because Funky accuses him of wrongdoing, but because he places him at the center of proximity. Presence becomes implication. It's not guilt, but relevance. And relevance is enough to attract scrutiny. This is where the phrase court erupts. It becomes metaphorical before it becomes literal. It describes the moment when audiences stop consuming the story passively and start prosecuting it conversationally. Threads break down timelines. Videos pause on phrases. Users replay segments where Funky's tone changes, where Tamar's answers soften, where certainty dissolves into deflection, and all of it circles back to one unresolved contradiction: how someone can publicly describe extreme injury while maintaining complete uncertainty about its cause, especially when others were present. The more that question goes unanswered, the more the story detaches from Tamar's control. It stops being her narrative and becomes a communal investigation. One fueled not by new evidence, but by unresolved testimony. By the end of this phase, the story has mutated. It is no longer about whether Tamar was hurt. It's about why clarity was withheld It's no longer about whether Funky was messy. It's about why his account aligns so cleanly while hers fractures. And it's no longer about gossip. It's about what happens when silence collides with specificity. Because once that collision happens, the audience doesn't wait for permission to draw conclusions. They construct them, okay? And they do so loudly enough that even the quietest parties are pulled into the noise. Section 2 ends with the story no longer asking what happened, it's asking who can afford not to answer. By the time the story reaches this phase, it no longer moves forward on new information. It moves inward. What the audience begins dissecting isn't what was said. It's why certain things were never said at all. Funky's account, stripped of theatrics, leaves behind a rigid framework: presence, discomfort, departure. Tamar's account, by contrast, remains suspended in uncertainty. And the longer that uncertainty remains untouched, the more it becomes the center of gravity. This is where perception hardens. Viewers begin noticing how Tamar's language avoids anchors. She doesn't say when things shifted. She doesn't say who was nearby. She doesn't say how she went from a night of socializing to a state she later described as catastrophic. The story she offered feels intentionally incomplete, not because details are missing, but because the missing details appear to have been chosen. And in an environment already primed by Funky's specificity, that choice reads as avoidance. The audience starts mapping intent. It's not framed as malice. It's framed as management. Tamar is seen not as someone confused, but as someone attempting to retain control over a narrative that has begun to move without her. Each time she references injury without cause, the speculation grows sharper. Not because people want scandal, but because the silence creates imbalance. Funky explains. She deflects. An imbalance always invites correction. That correction arrives in the form of communal interpretation. Online. Viewers begin arguing not over what happened, but over what Tamar could have said to stop the storm and didn't. They replay her interview. They isolate the moment she says she isn't aware of what really happened. They compare that to her earlier descriptions of blood, injury, and severity. And they ask the same question again and again. How can both be true at the same time? As that question spreads, something subtle shifts. Sympathy begins to fracture, not vanish, fracture. Some still defend Tamar, insisting trauma can blur memory and that public scrutiny can re-traumatize. Others counter that trauma doesn't usually coexist with selective clarity. They point out that Tamar knew enough to describe severity, but not enough to explain cause. That tension becomes the fault line dividing public opinion. And then there's Funky. He doesn't insert himself further. He doesn't escalate. But his presence looms larger precisely because he stops talking. The absence of retraction, apology, or clarification from him is interpreted as confidence. Viewers begin framing him as someone who said what he said, knowing it would stand. That framing isn't something he claims. It's something the audience assigns, and that assignment matters because it lends his account authority by default. Once that authority settles in, Mendeecees' name begins appearing in a different context. No longer as gossip, no longer as shock value, but as liability. The conversation stops asking whether he was inappropriate and starts asking why his proximity has never been addressed by the person at the center of the story. Again, this isn't an accusation. It's a vacuum. People don't say he did something, they say he was there. And presence, unaddressed, becomes the most dangerous variable of all, especially when paired with injury, confusion, and silence. This is where the word court takes on symbolic weight. Not because of legal proceedings described in the transcript, there are none, but because the public discourse begins to mirror adjudication. People weigh credibility. They measure consistency. They evaluate motive. They ask who benefits from ambiguity and who suffers from it. In that evaluation, Tamar's strategy, whether intentional or instinctive, appears to backfire. The more she avoids specifics, the more the narrative detaches from her control. The more she emphasizes not knowing, the more people assume others do. And that assumption migrates toward Yandy. Yandy's silence, already heavy, becomes almost gravitational. The audience begins treating it as confirmation of impact, if not, of detail. They speculate that what Yandy knows isn't being shared because it can't be, that whatever has been revealed has already shifted relationships, already caused rupture, already entered spaces where public commentary would only inflame things further. This is where the idea of revealing everything takes shape, not as a public spectacle, but as a private reckoning. Viewers imagine conversations that happened off camera, reactions that never made it to social media, decisions to withdraw rather than confront publicly. And in that imagined silence, Yandy becomes a proxy for the audience's frustration. She is the one people believe has clarity and refuses. To perform it, that belief intensifies scrutiny of everyone else. Why hasn't Tamar clarified? Why hasn't Mendeecees addressed proximity? Why hasn't Funky softened his stance? Each unanswered question feeds the same conclusion. This story has consequences, not emotional ones, structural ones. At this point, the audience stops waiting for confirmation and starts tracking fallout. They look for changes in behavior, missed appearances, avoided topics, anything that suggests containment rather than engagement. And when they find it, or think they do it, reinforces the sense that something serious sits beneath the surface. The phrase court erupts, begins circulating not as fact, but as metaphor. It captures the moment when discourse becomes judgment, when people stop asking what happened and start asking who's responsible for the confusion. That confusion, the audience decides, wasn't accidental. Funky's accusation of narrative manipulation gains traction here. Not because it's proven, but because it explains everything else. It explains the selective memory, a public vulnerability without accountability, the emotional appeal paired with factual absence. And once that explanation feels plausible, it becomes adhesive. It sticks to every unanswered question. By now, Tamar's condition is discussed less as a health crisis and more as a narrative, catalyst, not diminishing its seriousness, but reframing its function. Viewers argue that if the injury was as severe as described, clarity should have followed. If clarity didn't follow, then the injury has been leveraged, not processed. That interpretation is harsh, but it spreads. And it spreads because the transcript supports one undeniable truth. Tamar had opportunities to clarify and chose not. 2, Funky points this out repeatedly, not with mockery, but with exhaustion. He frames himself as collateral damage. As someone whose silence was weaponized against him, that framing resonates, especially with viewers who feel misled. Section 3 closes with the story no longer belonging to its originators. The audience has taken ownership. They have restructured the narrative around accountability rather than sympathy around consequence. Rather than chaos. And once a story reaches that stage, there's no neutral silence left, only interpretations waiting to harden into belief. By the time the story reaches its final stretch, the pressure no longer comes from what Funky said, comes from what no one has corrected. The absence of rebuttal begins to feel heavier than any accusation ever could. Tamar doesn't revise her account. Mendeecees doesn't contextualize his presence. Yandy doesn't step forward to close the loop. And Funky, having already accepted the label of being messy, does nothing to soften or clarify his stance. That collective stillness becomes the loudest development of all. At this stage, the narrative stops behaving like entertainment and starts behaving like exposure. Not exposure of facts, but exposure of vulnerability. Viewers sense that whatever exists behind the scenes is too consequential to be performed publicly. That belief isn't born from new information, it's born from restraint. People don't pull back when nothing is at stake. They pull back when the stakes are already defined. The idea of a courtroom, symbolic or otherwise, takes shape. Here, because the discourse has fully adopted judgment language. Not guilt, not innocence, but responsibility. Audiences begin. asking who allowed the ambiguity to persist. He benefited from silence. Who absorbed damage while others remained insulated. And those questions don't require legal confirmation to feel real. They only require imbalance. Funky's framing of himself as collateral damage becomes the emotional anchor of this phase. He positions himself not as the aggressor, but as the one who stayed quiet while narratives formed around him. He describes being dragged publicly, accused of negligence, and painted as disloyal, all while withholding details he claims could have shifted the narrative instantly. That restraint, whether strategic or emotional, reframes him as someone who believes silence has a cost, and that belief resonates. Viewers begin reevaluating earlier outrage. They revisit the assumption that Funky should have gone upstairs. He abandoned someone vulnerable. In light of his account, that assumption collapses. What replaces it is something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that the audience itself was guided toward outrage without full context. Once that realization takes hold, the tone changes. Comment sections become less reactive and more analytical. People stop arguing sides and start reconstructing motivations. Why would someone describe severe injury without naming cause? Why would proximity be omitted? Why would those closest to the situation choose non-response over correction? The most unsettling conclusion many arrive at is not that something criminal occurred, but that something reputational did. That boundaries were crossed in ways that can't be undone. That relationships were altered privately long before the public noticed. And that what's being protected now isn't truth, but fallout. This is where Mendeecees' role shifts again. Not from participant to perpetrator, that leap is never substantiated, but from background figure to unavoidable presence. The audience doesn't ask what he did, they ask why he hasn't spoken. And in modern media ecosystems, silence from someone repeatedly named becomes interpreted as counsel-driven, not emotional. That interpretation feeds the court Erupts framing. Not because it gavel drops, but because narratives harden. Because once legal language enters speculation, words like investigation, liability, exposure, it rarely leaves without consequence. Even if nothing formal ever happens, the association alone alters perception. Yandy's position becomes the emotional endpoint of the story. Funky's insistence that she is the only one wronged reframes the entire situation around betrayal rather than injury. It suggests that whatever occurred had ripple effects beyond physical harm. That trust was compromised. That silence is not neutrality, but damage control. Viewers begin treating Yandy as the one person whose reaction would confirm everything, and whose silence therefore confirms nothing. That paradox sustains the story, because if she speaks, it validates the weight of the moment. If she doesn't, sustains the belief that the truth is too volatile to release, and so the narrative stalls at maximum tension. Tamar's condition remains undefined, serious enough to reference, vague enough to evade explanation. Mendeecees remains present in the timeline, close enough to matter, distant enough to avoid specificity. Yandy remains silent, central enough to anchor sympathy, removed enough to avoid performance, and Funky remains unchanged, having said what he said and refusing to chase validation. This is where the story stops progressing and starts calcifying, not into fact, but into belief. Belief that something important happened. Belief that not everyone is being honest. Belief that silence is strategic. And once belief sets in, no clarification can fully reverse it. The final shape of the story isn't built on evidence. It's built on behavior. On who spoke, who didn't, who explained, who deflected, who accepted damage, and who seemed protected from it. That's why this chapter ends without resolution. Because resolution would require someone to do what no one has done yet, step into the open and risk consequence. Until then, the story remains suspended. Not unresolved, but UNCONTA, and in that suspension, one truth becomes unavoidable. Whatever. It was never just a misunderstanding. It was a collapse. Slow, quiet, and visible only once it was already complete. At this point, the story isn't asking for belief, it's asking for interpretation. You've heard what was said, you've seen what wasn't corrected, and you've watched how silence became the loudest response of all. So now, the question shifts to you. Do you believe Funky spoke because he wanted attention? Or because he was finally done carrying someone else's narrative? When Tamar says she doesn't know what happened, does that sound like trauma or strategy? And when injuries are described publicly but never explained, is that protection or control? Then there's Yandy. If she truly was the only one, wrong does Funky insists, does her silence signal strength or fallout? Is it possible everything has already been revealed, just not to us? And what does it mean when the person at the center of the storm says nothing while everyone else absorbs the damage? Most importantly, ask yourself this. If nothing serious happened, why does no one seem eager to clarify? Why does every gap feel intentional? And why does this story still feel unfinished, even after all the talking? Drop your thoughts below. Not just opinions, timelines, interpretations, moments from the transcript that stood out to you. Detail do you think people are overlooking? What question hasn't been answered yet? If you think this story is over, say why. Do you think it's just entering a quieter phase? Tell us what you're watching for next. Because stories like this don't disappear. They pause, like the video if you're still weighing the silence. Subscribe if you're following where this goes next. And share this with someone who thinks this was just drama, because by now it's clearly something else. We'll be watching.